takeover began without noise, without banners, and without permission, arriving instead as a smell that cut through Times Square's winter air like a secret too strong to ignore. Tourists slowed their steps before they understood why. Performers lost their rhythm. Even the flashing billboards seemed irrelevant as the scent of sizzling pork, sharp citrus, and smoke drifted between skyscrapers. It was Christmas week, when Times Square was supposed to smell like roasted nuts and commercial nostalgia, not something deeply human and unfamiliar. People followed the aroma instinctively, drawn past LED screens and brand mascots toward a modest pop-up stall glowing with steam. No one advertised it. No one announced it. Yet within minutes, a crowd formed, pulled together by hunger and curiosity. This was not chaos. It was convergence. And at the center stood Filipinos cooking pork sisig as if they were nowhere special at all, unaware that the world's most guarded commercial intersection was quietly slipping out of corporate control and into cultural memory. By early afternoon, the usual flow of Times Square had shifted in ways city planners could never model. Foot traffic no longer moved in straight lines. It curved toward the heat of the grill. People asked strangers what they were smelling, and strangers smiled, suddenly bonded by appetite. The stall itself was unremarkable, steel pans, folding tables, handwritten menu boards. But the energy around it was magnetic. Filipinos worked shoulder to shoulder, chopping pork into precise fragments, flipping sizzling portions with muscle memory refined over decades. Conversations flowed in Tagalog, Ilocano, English, laughter spilling freely. Every plate handed across the counter slowed time. First bites triggered silence, then disbelief. This was not fast food. It demanded attention. Phones came out, not to pose but to document reactions. No influencer prompted it. No campaign seeded it. The moment spread the old way, mouth to mouth, sent to instinct. Times Square, usually immune to sincerity, was beginning to listen. The stall existed for a simple reason, one that felt almost laughable in hindsight. It was meant to raise funds for Filipino migrant families struggling through winter rent and heating bills. The permit had been approved months earlier, buried beneath corporate events and holiday promotions. Sisig was chosen because it was practical and meaningful, a dish born from making something extraordinary out of what others discarded. No one predicted that Christmas timing would transform it. For Filipinos, Christmas is not a single day but a season of belonging, stretching across months, built on shared meals and open doors. That spirit crossed oceans intact. As more Filipinos finished work and arrived, they didn't rush. They stayed. They greeted each other like relatives, even when meeting for the first time. Outsiders sensed something different unfolding. This wasn't a transaction, it was an invitation. And once accepted, it was impossible to step away unchanged. As daylight faded, the crowd thickened instead of dispersing. Normally, Times Square fed on urgency, but tonight patience ruled. People waited without complaint, warmed by conversation and rising steam. A Broadway usher stood beside a delivery driver, debating which bite tasted better. A police officer stepped out of line only to return moments later, drawn back by the smell. The sizzle of pork cut through traffic noise like a drumbeat, steady and commanding. Elders behind the grill explained the dish's history to anyone who asked, describing how sisig emerged from survival and became celebration. Listeners leaned in, forks paused, realizing they were tasting more than food. Each plate carried memory, resilience, and pride. Christmas music echoed faintly from storefronts, but the real soundtrack was laughter and metal against steel. For the first time that season, Times Square felt less like a marketplace and more like a living room shared by strangers. Something else was happening beneath the surface, quieter but more powerful. Filipinos who had spent years blending in felt themselves standing taller. Nurses from Queens, Caregivers from Brooklyn, IT workers from New Jersey recognized the scent before they saw the stall, as unmistakable as a voice calling their name. Some ate standing, eyes closed, letting memory flood back. Others video called family across oceans, turning their phones toward the grill. "Look," they said. "We're here." What they meant went far beyond geography. For many, this was the first time their culture occupied space without apology. No adjustments. No softening. Non-Filipinos asked genuine questions, not out of politeness but fascination. Why chop the pork so fine? Why calamansi instead of lemon? Why serve it sizzling? Answers came freely, wrapped in stories. Sisig became language. Christmas became context. And Times Square, accustomed to spectacle, surrendered to authenticity. By nightfall, cameras noticed what algorithms could not predict. Crowds ignored million-dollar screens in favor of a stall barely lit by string lights. Media crews arrived late, scrambling to label the moment. Some called it a food trend. Others framed it as cultural fusion. None of the labels fit. Reporters tried to deliver rehearsed lines, but their scripts dissolved mid-bite. One producer admitted on air that she hadn't expected something this simple to matter. The word lingered uncomfortably. Sisig had never been simple. It was history disguised as comfort, labor turned into love. Christmas amplified its power, turning cold into contrast and loneliness into hunger for connection. Strangers shared tables. Accents mixed freely. The hierarchy of the city flattened. Status meant nothing when everyone waited for the same plate. For a few hours, Times Square forgot how to sell and remembered how to gather. Behind the counter, the work never stopped. Hands moved in rhythm, guided by years of repetition. One woman flipped pork while wiping sweat from her brow despite the freezing air. She had spent 15 years working night shifts as a caregiver, invisible in most rooms. Tonight, she anchored the center of the city. Her son filmed quietly from the side, realizing too late that something historic was unfolding without ceremony. Supplies ran low, then mysteriously replenished. Friends arrived carrying bags of onions, calamansi, and plates, responding to messages spreading through group chats. No single person directed the operation. Leadership flowed naturally, shifting as needed. When asked who organized everything, the cooks laughed. "We just showed up." The answer confused outsiders but resonated deeply with Filipinos. By Anahan, the instinct to lift together had entered Times Square, unannounced and unstoppable. Tourists who planned to stay minutes lingered for hours. Children who hated crowds sat quietly eating, soothed by warmth and rhythm. A man from Iowa admitted he'd never spoken to a Filipino before that night. "I feel like I missed something," he said, surprising himself. The documentary lens captured faces transformed not by spectacle but recognition. This takeover was gentle, almost polite, yet absolute. No flags waved. No chants echoed. Still, Filipino presence dominated. Even the towering screens felt like background noise. Christmas ads played above, but below something honest unfolded. People exchanged recipes. Elders corrected pronunciations patiently. Sisig shifted from curiosity to comfort. Times Square, long accustomed to consumption without connection, became a place of shared experience. Public space reclaimed its original purpose, not to extract attention, but to host humanity without conditions. As midnight approached, exhaustion crept in. The cooks debated closing. Bodies ached. Ingredients thinned. Yet the crowd refused to dissolve. Instead, it softened. People leaned against barriers, reluctant to leave. Someone suggested music. Another suggested prayer. What followed was neither organized nor rehearsed. A voice began singing a Filipino Christmas carol, quiet and unassuming. Others joined, harmonies forming naturally. Non-Filipinos hummed along, unsure of words but certain of feeling. The sound floated upward, swallowed by glass and steel, but persistent. Tears surfaced without embarrassment. Cameras recorded them, but explanations failed. This wasn't nostalgia alone. It was validation. A culture often reduced to labor had revealed its soul in public. Sisig opened the door. Christmas held it open. When the last plate was served, applause rose, not for performance but gratitude. The stall closed quietly. The scent lingered longer than expected. When the crowd finally thinned, Times Square slowly resumed its familiar rhythm, but something felt altered. People walked differently, slower, as if reluctant to return fully to routine. The following days brought headlines struggling to explain what had happened. Some framed it as a viral food moment. Others described it as accidental marketing. None captured the truth. This wasn't promotion. It was presence. Filipinos returned to hospitals, offices, and homes carrying something lighter. Restaurants across the city reported customers asking deeper questions, staying longer, listening. Sisig sales rose, but more importantly, respect followed. Christmas passed, but memory endured. Those who tasted sisig that night would associate it forever with warmth, belonging, and surprise. Times Square hadn't just smelled different. It had felt different. And for a city defined by fleeting moments, that feeling lingered longer than expected. Understood. Continuing from paragraph 11 to paragraph 30, maintaining the same documentary tone, fictional continuity, and paragraph-only structure. E. The story did not end when the grills cooled. In the days after Christmas, people who had been there struggled to explain why it stayed with them. Friends listened politely, assuming exaggeration, until they were told it wasn't about food at all. It was about how a place designed for spectacle surrendered to sincerity without resistance. Filipinos noticed subtle changes first. Coworkers asked questions they had never asked before. Neighbors mentioned the smell, the singing, the feeling. For once, Filipinos were not framed as background labor or cheerful helpers. They were the reason the city paused. That realization carried weight. Christmas had always been emotional for migrants, filled with longing and distance. This time it felt reciprocal. The city had given something back. Times Square, symbolic and cold, had reflected their warmth outward. And once that exchange occurred, it could not be undone or forgot. N. Community leaders attempted to trace how the moment spread so quickly, but there was no single origin point. No celebrity post triggered it. No media outlet crowned it. It moved the way memory moves, through senses rather than statements. The smell arrived first, then curiosity, then belonging. Sociologists later described it as sensory convergence, but Filipinos used a simpler word, home. That word echoed across conversations. Home was no longer only where they came from. It had appeared, briefly but unmistakably, in the center of Manhattan. Christmas magnified that feeling because it stripped people down emotionally. Loneliness sharpened openness. Cold made warmth precious. Sisig became the medium, but connection was the message. Even those who had never heard of the Philippines before that night spoke of it with familiarity afterward, as if it were no longer distant. That shift mattered more than any headline. For younger Filipinos born abroad, the takeover carried a different resonance. Many had grown up translating themselves, flattening accents, minimizing food smells in lunchrooms. Watching their culture command attention without explanation altered something internal. Pride replaced hesitation. Parents noticed their children asking questions about traditions they had once ignored. Why sisig? Why Christmas so long? Why sharing so instinctive? Answers turned into conversations that extended late into the night. The event became a reference point, a story passed down. I was there, some would say years later. Others would say, I know someone who was. That proximity to history mattered. It reframed identity not as something inherited quietly, but something lived publicly. Times Square became proof that assimilation did not require erasure. Christmas had delivered that lesson wrapped in smoke, laughter, and sound. City officials reviewed footage afterward, puzzled by how order had been maintained without formal control. There were no incidents, no conflicts, no urgency to intervene. The crowd self-regulated, guided by courtesy and shared purpose. This surprised authorities accustomed to managing behavior through barriers and announcements. What they witnessed instead was communal discipline rooted in respect. Filipinos queued naturally, shared space instinctively, deferred to elders automatically. These behaviors weren't taught that night, they were brought fully formed. Observers noted how conflict never gained traction. Disagreements dissolved quickly, softened by humor and food. Christmas softened edges further, reminding people they were already in a season of grace. Times Square had hosted countless gatherings, but rarely one that required so little enforcement. The takeover revealed an alternative model of public assembly, one driven not by control, but by care. Economists later debated the value of the moment, attempting to measure impact in numbers. Increased restaurant traffic, temporary congestion, viral impressions. But those metrics missed the core exchange. Value was created in trust, not transactions. People who had shared a meal together remembered each other differently afterward. Barriers fell without discussion. Sisig functioned as equalizer, removing assumptions before they could form. Christmas context deepened the effect, aligning generosity with appetite. The dish's origins, transforming leftovers into something cherished, mirrored the migrant experience itself. That symbolism was not lost on those who understood it. For Filipinos, the moment affirmed that their contributions were not marginal. They were central. For others, it challenged unexamined hierarchies. Times Square did not feel conquered afterward. It felt reintroduced to itself. Filipino elders spoke of the night with quiet satisfaction, rather than celebration. They had seen cycles before, visibility rising and fading. This felt different. It lacked performance. There was nothing to sell afterward except memory. That purity gave it endurance. Churches referenced it in sermons. Community centers replayed videos during gatherings. The smell of sisig became shorthand for unexpected unity. Christmas decorations were taken down across the city, but something intangible remained. Even skeptics admitted they hadn't felt that kind of warmth in public space before. It raised uncomfortable questions. Why did it take food from a migrant community to slow the city down? Why did authenticity feel so rare it became unforgettable? Those questions lingered without answers. The takeover did not resolve them. It simply made them impossible to ignore. Months later, when winter returned, people wondered if it could happen again. Some hoped to recreate it. Others understood it could not be replicated deliberately. Its power lay in unplanned alignment, timing, emotion, openness. Attempts to commercialize it failed quietly. Sponsored events lacked soul. What worked once resisted repetition. Filipinos understood this instinctively. They did not chase the moment. They absorbed it. Sisig remained sisig. Christmas remained Christmas. The city moved on, but perspective shifted subtly. Small changes accumulated. More Filipino-owned pop-ups received attention. More conversations began with curiosity instead of assumption. These outcomes were not dramatic, but they were durable. Cultural change rarely announces itself loudly. It embeds itself quietly, like a smell that returns unexpectedly, reminding you of where you once stood and how you felt there. For those who had eaten that night, memory attached itself to sensation. The crackle of meat, the sting of citrus, the warmth in fingers holding a paper plate against the cold. These details surfaced uninvited months later, triggered by unrelated moments. Memory works that way, binding emotion to sense. Christmas intensified the binding. The season already carried reflection and vulnerability. Sisig slipped into that emotional archive effortlessly. People recalled not just what they tasted, but who stood beside them. Strangers whose names they never learned became part of the story. That anonymity made the memory universal. It belonged to no one and everyone. Times Square, usually a backdrop for individual ambition, briefly hosted collective memory instead. Filipino creatives later referenced the takeover in art, essays, and music. Not directly, but thematically. Smoke, heat, crowd standing still. These motifs appeared repeatedly. The event became a metaphor for recognition without demand. Christmas framed it as grace rather than conquest. Despite the dramatic headlines, no one had been overtaken. Something had been revealed. That distinction mattered deeply to those telling the story accurately. It was not about dominance. It was about presence. Sisig did not shout. It waited. And in waiting, it gathered attention organically. That lesson extended beyond food. It suggested an alternative way to exist in loud spaces, by being fully oneself without insisting on being noticed. As years passed, Times Square hosted new spectacles, louder and brighter. Yet among those who remembered, comparison lingered. New events felt hollow by contrast, impressive but distant. The Sisig night had been imperfect and unscripted. That imperfection was its strength. Christmas had given permission for vulnerability, and vulnerability invited connection. People spoke of it when discussing what cities could be at their best. Not efficient. Not profitable. Human. The takeover entered local folklore, retold with variations but consistent emotion. Each retelling reinforced its place in memory. Not as anomaly, but as possibility. Proof that even the most commercial spaces could be reclaimed briefly by community without resistance. Filipinos who moved away carried the story with them. In other cities, during other holidays, they searched for similar moments. Sometimes they found fragments. Sometimes they created them quietly. The Times Square night became a template not to copy, but to trust. Trust that showing up fully mattered. Trust that warmth traveled. Christmas reinforced that trust annually, bringing the memory back into focus. Each December, someone would mention it casually, and recognition would spark. You were there too? The answer often was yes. That shared memory became its own community marker, subtle but enduring. The takeover also reframed how people understood food narratives. It challenged the idea that cultural cuisine needed explanation or refinement to be accepted. Sisig arrived unapologetically. Its complexity revealed itself through experience, not translation. Christmas softened resistance, but the dish did the rest. That approach influenced how other communities presented themselves afterward. Less justification, more presence. The night demonstrated that curiosity followed confidence naturally. Times Square, once thought immune to subtlety, proved otherwise. That realization reshaped assumptions about audiences and space. Older migrants, long accustomed to invisibility, spoke of a quiet relief afterward. Not triumph, but release. They had not needed to prove anything. Their existence had spoken sufficiently. Sisig had carried their history without words. Christmas had framed it with generosity. That combination felt complete. They returned to routine without bitterness, content in having been seen once without compromise. That contentment radiated outward, influencing how they moved through the city afterward. Less guarded, more assertive. Younger observers documented the event obsessively, archiving videos and reactions. They understood its rarity. Not because it was large, but because it was true. Algorithms could amplify it, but they did not create it. That distinction mattered to a generation raised on performance. The takeover demonstrated authenticity's quiet power. Christmas contextualized it emotionally, reminding viewers that sincerity resonated most when people were already open. The lesson extended beyond culture into how moments were valued. Critics who attempted to dismiss the night as novelty missed its deeper resonance. Novelty fades quickly. This did not. It reappeared in conversations unexpectedly, often during discussions about belonging. The memory functioned as evidence rather than argument. It answered questions before they were asked. Did community still matter in cities? Yes. Could strangers connect without mediation? Yes. Could warmth disrupt systems built on speed? Yes. Sisig and Christmas had answered Etly. The takeover's legacy lived not in replication, but in permission. Permission to occupy space honestly. Permission to bring full culture forward. Permission to trust that connection did not require spectacle. Filipinos internalized that lesson deeply. Others absorbed it subconsciously. Times Square returned to normal operations, but normal felt slightly altered. A crack had appeared in certainty. Through it, possibility eeped. Every December afterward, as decorations returned, some searched the air unconsciously. Smells trigger memory before logic. Most years, nothing happened. And that was fine. The power lay in knowing it could. That knowledge changed expectation. Christmas no longer belonged exclusively to commerce there. It had hosted something truer once. That history mattered even without repetition. In interviews years later, participants struggled to summarize the night succinctly. Language felt insufficient. They resorted to gestures, to smiles, to pauses. That inability to compress the experience signaled its depth. It had not been designed for explanation. It had been lived. Sisig served as entry point, not conclusion. Christmas provided frame, not message. The meaning emerged Tively. What Times Square experienced was not invasion, despite headlines. It was invitation accepted. Filipinos did not arrive to conquer. They arrived to cook. The city responded by gathering. That mutual movement defined the night. Christmas transformed it from coincidence into memory. And memory, once formed collectively, becomes history. In the end, the takeover resisted ownership. No one could claim it fully. That was its strength. It belonged to everyone who stood still long enough to feel it. Sisig faded from the air, but its imprint remained. Christmas came and went, but connection endured. Times Square continued flashing, selling, moving. Yet beneath that surface, a quieter truth lingered, that even the loudest places could be softened, briefly, by warmth carried honestly.